Okay. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm sorry if the video hasn't started just yet. We had a lot of technical issues tonight. We are continuing our shiur finally with our discussion of Tachanun in modern times. And the video will start in a second. Sorry if you're listening on Spotify, watching on Spotify or YouTube. The discussion continues after this Hanukkah break that we just had on the development of Tachanun. First covered the early Tachanun, how it began in the Beit HaMikdash, how it began in the times of the Tanaim and Amoraim, and then we went on to the medieval. So just to recap what we did in the previous weeks, we first saw how in the time of the Tanaim and Amoraim, there was a practice of Nefilat Apayim, and there was also a practice of supplications after tefillah. We didn't know if they were one and the same. We noted that there's a difference between, of course, the bowing, the physical movement, and the tefillah. However, we postulated some theories, especially about the prayer. That first of all, like Ismail Bogan points out, it's very likely that early Tachanun was a compromise, so to speak. After Gamliel Biyavne instituted a tefillas keba, a statutory liturgy, which people had to do every single day, at least 2 or 3 times, the reaction was that people didn't like statutory liturgy. They didn't want to say the same thing every day. And therefore, there was a time after the Shemona Esrei where people could say their own extemporaneous prayers. And it was a counterbalance. The Tachinais and the Tachanunim were a counterbalance to the Tefillas HaKeva, Rabbi Gamliel Biyavne. There's another theory that I didn't see until literally, I think it was yesterday or today, and that is that of Tzvi Karl. And he makes a compromise between the various Gemarot and sources from the Tanaim. And his belief is that the Nefilat Apayim and the Tachanunim were completely separate things originally. He believes that the Nefilat Apayim was a practice that was only done on fast days. And it's actually convincing because you see a lot of the times the Gemara mentions Nefilat Apayim, it's talking about fast days. In his opinion, because people used to bow on Monday and used to fast on Monday and Thursday, the practice of Nefilat Apayim got borrowed to Monday and Thursday. And then from there, Nefilat Apayim began to be said every day of the week during the Tachanunim. So I thought that was a really interesting theory, worth mentioning and bringing up about early Tachanun. Then we moved on to the medieval development of Tachanun. What we see after a few hundred years of radio silence from the time of the Amoraim until the Geonim, what we see develop in the time of the Geonim. As far as we can tell, at least in the early Geonim, there's no fixed formula. It really seems that it began with extemporaneous prayers, but the Geonim begin to discuss what is the halachot of Tachanun. First of all, they set down that it's a reshut. It is optional, and therefore, if it's a day of Simcha or Moed or Yom Tov, you don't have to say it. Not important. They discuss the manner of bowing, how a person should bow, and they even suggest tefillot for people to say on the days of Tachanunim, and for a regular day of Tachanun. And we also see the earliest development of special things for Monday and Thursdays that we should say more techinot on Monday and Thursdays, and various reasons are given by the Rishonim, because Monday and Thursday is the day of. Perhaps Moshe went up and down from the Har Sinai, and different reasons why Monday and Thursday are a day of where we need extra penitence. Regardless, we see the earliest halachot develop in the time of the Geonim, and then finally in the time of the Rishonim, we begin to see the first trends towards fixity. While the early Rishonim, at least in the Sephardi lands, it's during the time of the early Rishonim, it seems that the prayers were very much extemporaneous and free form. After about the 11th, 12th, 13th century, we see a trend towards picking specific texts. In the lands of Ashkenaz, we see this really early. In the 11th century, we already see Machzor Vitri and Siddur Rokeach prescribing certain appropriate texts and Pirkei Tehillim, which people could read, and certain tefillot, which were appropriate. And then the Sfaradim, a little bit later, 12th century onwards, you see that 12th, 13th century, they begin to recommend different texts to be said. We saw a brief episode with Avram ben Rambam where he tried making people bow the same way the Muslims do, and we had a lot of fun in that discussion. Tonight, I want to discuss the history of Tachanun in modern times. And if you're not a historian, then I'll remind you that modern times means from the 1500s until roughly from the 16th century to the 20th century, roughly. So from the year 1500 to the year 2000. Once you get to 21st century, some people like to call that postmodern. However, if we're going to discuss Tachanun in the time of the Achronim, we have to also understand the zeitgeist of every single century. And I thought about this for the past 3 weeks, exactly how in the world I was going to give a shiur on Tachanun during the time of the Achronim. Because, frankly, I'm sorry, let me share my screen finally. Frankly, there are a dozen different nuschaot. Historically, there are even more. We could spend time studying each nusach and give an entire shiur on the development of that nusach. For example, the Minhag Ashkenaz, the Minhag Tzarfat, the Minhag Catalonia, the Minhag Sfarad or Spain, the Minhag of Romania, of Greece, the Minhag of Italy, the Minhag of North Africa and Morocco, the Minhag of Syria, the Minhag of Persia, Minhag Iraq. Each Minhag, did I miss anybody? Italy, Roma, whatever. Each Minhag in the past 500 years had a very peculiar and very interesting development. And I remember when we first gave the shiur on Tachanun, I gave the shiur in 7 different parts. And I was mostly concerned with lower criticism, essentially looking at the text and the nuances of the text. And if anyone is interested in that, please reference the first round of shiurim that we did. It's still available if you go back in the podcasts. But if I was going to do an exhaustive shiur on Tachanun tonight, especially in the modern period, in the past 500 years, there would be no end. You could give mamash 10 shiurim about how each nusach developed. And I just don't think that that's a useful way to spend our time. Frankly, it's more useful to understand each century and understand what kind of trends were happening during each century. And that'll help us better understand what we could expect in each century. What could we expect to see in each century of the development of Tachanun? And that's the line I want to take tonight, the way I want to approach the study of Tachanun in the modern period. Let's look at it historically, and then the rest of it should fall into place. Meaning, if we understand the zeitgeist of each century, it'll give us a better feeling for at least the religious zeitgeist. It'll give us a better feeling for what developed in the spheres of Tachanun. And of course, this is not going to be a history class for the past 500 years. If anyone's interested in history of the past 500 years, I'm sure there are history books. But let's begin with what the Jewish people inherited from the Middle Ages. So let's start like this. Every community had their own minhagim. Being that Tachanun was seen as an optional prayer and seen as not halachically stringent, it was very common for every community, village, town to have their own peculiar, their own unique way of doing Tachanun. And many of the early poskim in the 15th and 16th century, especially look at the Shulchan Aruch and the Darkei Moshe, many of these poskim are very gentle. They say, and each community does the way they do. Every community does their own minhag. They are not specific about how people should do Tachanun. And they don't prescribe specifically which psalms, which Tehillim, which texts to recite. And that's because they're trying to be careful. They didn't want to offend anybody's sensibilities. They didn't want to change any Siddurim. Because essentially it's davar shel minhag, and anything that the people do, as long as they are supplications, whether it's bakashot, whether it's things that are for teshuvah, they didn't really want to change any of that. Now, what we know from the Middle Ages is that, I'm going to share my screen here, is that there were a couple of things that became common. There were a couple of, am I in the right place? I don't think I'm at the right place yet. But there were a couple of parts of the of the tefillah, which became commonplace to most people. So most communities, for example, began to receive the V'hu for the Mondays and Thursdays. Most communities would say at least one parak of Tilim, and most communities would have Anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh. Some communities would have a Vidoy. Some communities would have much more. What's fascinating is that there's a whole set of minhagim that were, so to speak, commonplace, especially in Spain and in other places, that have been lost to time. And many people are not aware that these tefillot and parts of Tachanunim are extinct. But let me just show you how the modern period is almost shaped by not just what they included, but also what they excluded. So if you're looking at my screen here, I'm showing you a Machzor Aram Sobra from the 1500s. This is one of the early Machzorim from Aleppo. This one is not completely purely Aleppoan, Aram Soba. There is a lot of influence here from Spain. But if you look here, there's the Shivim V'Shtayim Pesukim. The Tachanunim after Shmona Esrei begins with the 72 Pesukim. Bata Hashem Magen Badi Kvodi Umerim Roshi. This is a mysterious set of 72 Pesukim, which historically the Ashkenazim also used to say, and they would say it after Aleinu. We have today no idea what this was. It sounds like it was some sort of Segula. Maybe it corresponded to the 72 names of Hashem. But as far as I looked, as far as I could find, nobody really mentions this. Nobody has any hint to what this early minhag was. Perhaps I didn't turn over every rock, but I've been around the block, and perhaps I just missed it. I mean, nobody really discusses none of the poskim, none of the mikubalim. Nobody discusses these so-called 72 pesukim of Vahata Hashem Agin Badi. We don't know what they were. Perhaps they were a sigula. It is 72 pesukim. I'm not going to bore you with going through all of them, but if you could look here on my screen, you'll see how many there are. And also, older Ashkenazi Machzorim have it after Aleinu. Many of them do, or Ashkenazi Siddurim, I should say. So this is a great mystery of history. I don't know what it is. The closest parallel I found was that in the Shla, I forgot where. I forgot precisely where, but the Shla mentions this 72 Pesukim, but a completely different set. He has a set of 72 Pesukim to say if you're next to a person who's dying, a gosis. I don't know what the significance of any of this is. I know the number 72 has to do with the name of Hashem, but more than that, I can't help you. Then you could see here, there was common in many places to say, this was also popular in a couple of places, especially in Spain. Then here's a fun one. Yiratzon milfanecha Hashem Hagadol Gibor Banora Haizuz Va'amitzvah Adir Chazak Hayotze Min HaMizmor Hazeh. Right. So first they would say that Tehillim, that Lamanatseach, and then they would say especially Yiratzon to invoke the power of one of the angels for each day. Meaning v'takshiv l'tchinati bayom hazeh. Let's say Yom Rishon. Shemazalo Aryeh Malacho Rifael Misharto Chama. Or if it was Monday, Mazalo is Mazal is Sartan, Malacho Gavriel, its Malach is Gavriel, Misharto Livana, and its assistant is the Livana. Fascinating stuff. There was a special Yehi Ratzon just for asking Hashem to accept your prayer, especially to invoke the Malach and the Mazal and the assistant to that Mazal of that specific day. And then there's another Yehi Ratzon here, which I'm not going to go on the length, but it's essentially another Techina, which ends with a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem hagomel chasadim tovim. Fascinating. People would feel that it was appropriate for some reason to add a bracha and to make up their own tefillah for Tachanunim. And this is not just unique in the Middle Ages to Sfaradim. Even the Ashkenazim have something like this. And if you look at the Maser Vitri, they have an entire tefillah which begins with Rachum V'Chanun and it ends with Baruch Atah Hashem Shomeh Tefillah. However, this is already, we're looking here at the 16th century. So that's already 500 years later after the Maser Vitri. It appears that most of these things which were invented by various people in the Middle Ages didn't stick around. The ones that are mentioned mostly by the poskim are the ones that stick around. Here's one. Today, the only people who say that are the Temanim. But the essentials, like the Rachum V'Chanun and the L'David Mizmor Elech Hashem Nafshi Asa, those are there. So now, those are just some of the odd things that were there in the Middle Ages. In the 16th century, what do we see? We see that the earliest Siddurim, especially the ones that were printed for local communities, still retained a lot of those earlier minhagim and a lot of those nuances. You will find that 16th century Siddurim will print things, even in Nusach Ashkenaz, but they'll print things that perhaps people don't say anymore, like certain things at the end of Tachanun. I won't go into length, but there are certain pesukim that they'll add, and Shemor Shevet Yisrael and Avinu Malkeinu that they'll add that not everybody will do anymore. One of the most frustrating parts of studying Tachanun in the modern era is that many of the Siddurim that are both from the Middle Ages and to the turn of the modern era, in the 1500s, most of those Siddurim don't provide instructions. They don't actually tell the reader this is for day 2 and that this is for day 2 for Monday and Thursday, or these should only be said on a day which is a fast day, or this piyut should be said at your discretion, or this piyut should be said on Monday and this piyut should be said on Thursday. We find in practice people did that, but the text itself and the Siddurim themselves don't provide us for evidence for that. Now, if you are trying to rewind the clock and you're trying to prove that people did say something or didn't say something, finding old Siddurim doesn't tell you everything. It just show you that was an optional text. It doesn't tell you what people actually did in practice. Now, besides for that, the first thing you see in the 16th century is that these Siddurim that reflected modern customs eventually homogenized into one, not into one. Eventually, various local customs would homogenize into one custom per grouping. So a lot of the earlier minhagim that were particular, like a Portuguese minhag or a Catalonian minhag, just as an example, or a Dutch minhag, the printers weren't willing to make Siddurim for each and every person. So we find a homogenization, and a lot of printers did not want to print minority customs, and therefore a lot of early minority customs for Tachanun were lost. That's the first thing you're going to find. That's another thing you're going to find in the nature of the 16th century Tachanunim. Another thing you're going to find is that the Beit Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch and the Darkei Moshe had a massive influence on the printings of the Siddurim, because what is prescribed in the Torah and what is described in the Beit Yosef and what is prescribed in the Darkei Moshe and the Ramah, those prescriptions, at least the elemental halachic things, are what the rabbis who edited the coming Siddurim at the end of the 16th century look to, right? If you were somebody like Avishai Levi Horowitz, if you were like the Shla, or if you were the Chida in the 17th century, or whoever, if you were going to make a Siddur, your rabbinical advisor was going to, or if you were the Rav, you were going to look to the poskim first. And if you look at a tefillah, like something that begins with the Hiratzon, talks about Malachim, and then ends with Baruch Atah Hashem, and it doesn't come from a Gemara, you're going to tell the printer, I'll leave that one out. We don't need that one. So it's quite possible that a lot of these tefillos were left out based on the force of the poskim, not because the poskim, forced them out, but mostly because they were seen as optional. They were seen as almost made up arbitrarily, which they were, and they weren't seen as canonical, is what I'm trying to say. They weren't seen as canonical. They weren't seen as very important, and therefore it was mutter to get rid of them, since it's just, at the end of the day, it's a reshus. It's not a chayva. So that's another feature we see in the 1500s. Lastly, the most important thing for the 1500s is the Arizal. So in the 1500s, we have Arizal leaving his legacy with Chaim Vital in the Sha'ar Kavanot. And in the Sha'ar Kavanot, I won't give a page number because the pages are different, but in my book it's 278, page Reish Ayin Ches. In the Sha'ar Kavanot, Chaim Vital says that his Rebbe the Arizal had a preference for how to do Tachanun. And it's very unlike the Siddur that the Arizal himself used. And I'll share my screen here with you. This is if I can do this, I'm sorry. This is the Siddur Reish Pei Daled, what I'm showing here on my screen. This Siddur is a Siddur that the Arizal himself grew up with. Perhaps he got the earlier version from the 1480s, but at the end of the day, this Siddur, this Siddur Reish Pedal, is what he used. And as you'll be able to see here in a second, it begins with the 72 Pesukim. Then it goes on to the Lamnatseach Bekorianeni. Then it has the Hiratzon about the Malachim. Then it has another Hiratzon which ends with Baruch Atah Hashem Agomel Chasadim Tovim. Then it goes into the Sheni V'Chamishi. It has two Vayavars and a Vidoy. It goes into the V'Hurachum that we're familiar with from Ashkenaz and the Poskim. And finally, oh wow, we got to keep going. Ala Kolit Gadal. So no, sorry, that's taking out the Torah. Finally, at the very end, Avinu Malkenus Vanachnu Lo Neda. Okay, a whole long section. Now, the Arizal himself didn't really like all this. The Arizal was not one to change the Siddur. He really, really was conservative and kept things the way they are. And for the most part, he davened like everybody else did. He followed this Siddur almost like everybody else did. The Beit Yosef says that in his time, the Siddur didn't have two Vayavars, it had three. So I'm not sure which Siddur he's talking about, but perhaps the Siddur just doesn't reflect the common practice, because sometimes Siddurs lie to you. But essentially, what the Arizal prescribed is, he said, what's important to do is first do the Vidoy, right? You start Tachanun with the Vidoy, then you do Vayavar, then you do two more times the Vayavar. That was the Arizal's prescription. Right, you do a Shamnu or Tamanu. If it was Monday and Thursday, you do three times the Ve'avar, but always start Tachanun. First, you do. I should just correct myself. First, you do Vidoy, then you do Yud Gimel Midot, you do a Ve'avar Hashem, and then you do Nefilat Apayim. Rachum v'chanun chatanu l'fenecha achim aleinu v'shienu l'David elach Hashem nafshi asan, and finally v'anachnu lo neda. That was a daily Tachanun according to the Arizal. Now, the Arizal, even though he's incredibly conservative with changing the Siddur, the text on the page here by Tachanun didn't really matter to him because everybody knew that this stuff was not obligatory. This stuff was completely non-canonical. So the Arizal felt no problem with telling people do this and not do that, because even the poskim say, at certain times, you could say these and don't say those and don't say these. You don't, it's not important. And if you were running out of time, you could say just one. This wasn't like the Rambam says in his own Siddur Tefillah. If you have time for some, say time for these. If you don't have time for all of them, don't say all of them. The Arizal is doing the same thing. He's saying, I prefer Kabbalistically, you're supposed to do Vidoy first, then Ve'avar, and then Nefilat Apayim. That's how you're supposed to do it. Now, he wasn't being Mechadesh Vidoy. It's not like he was making an innovation here. In medieval times, especially in Provence and in a couple areas, it was very common to do a Vidoy or to do a Ve'avar. This is not his chidush. It just wasn't the pervasive minhag among all communities to do a Vidoy and a Ve'avar every single day. Some would only do it on Monday and Thursday, but it was a matter of minhag. The Arizal's influence, however, had a tremendous effect. And after some time, when you get already to the 1600s, most Sfaradi Siddurim are starting to change to the way Rav Chaim Vital prescribes it. Even more importantly, is that in the 1600s, we find Ashkenazi Siddurim begin to adopt one or two things from the Sfaradim. Most notably, Rav Shai Halevi Horowitz, the Shla, in his famous Siddur Shar Shemayim, which was printed so many times, the Shla preferred Al Pi Kabbalah to say the Sfaradim Mizmor, LeDavid Elach Hashem Nafshi Asa, because he saw the Zohar and he knows how important that Mizmor Tilim was Kabbalistically for Nefilat Apayim. So the Shla preferred the Sephardi version. So because he didn't want to change the way the Ashkenazim had been doing it for 600 years, I should say really 400 years, he puts both of them side by side. And the truth is, even the early Ashkenazim used to choose one or the other. So it's not like he was inventing something. He was just changing back to the way it used to be done. He was saying, these are alternatives. In the Shar Shemaim, he gives two alternatives. You could say this one, or you could say that one, the Sephardi way or the Ashkenaz way. And the truth is, the Ashkenazim used to do it that way also. So it doesn't really matter. But the Shla brought some Sephardic influence into the Siddur in the 1600s. The 1600s was a time of very turbulent acceptance of Kabbalah. So you'll find a whole mix of attitudes towards Tachanun in relation to the Kabbalah. You have people who reject it outright. You have the Ashkenazim who are purists, and they are going to reject anything which sounds like it's Kabbalistic, especially after the Shabtai Tzvi debacle. And then you have the Sfaradim who lean in heavily and follow exactly to a T what they believe is the Kabbalistically perfect way to do things. Okay, so that's so much for a brief. Again, there's a lot to cover, but that's a brief. Um, I think we're for the moment we'll skip over the 1600s because the 1700s are a lot more interesting. The 1700s, especially that's when the Shlomo moved to Eretz Yisrael, but that's when we begin to see this cross contamination because when the movement of the Hasidim begins, many of these Sidurims that are so-called Sidur Sfarad begin to adopt minhagim that are very much Sfaradi. So many of the so-called the new Hasidic movements begin to mimic the way it's done, the Tachanun, the way as the way it's done in the um Sfardi Siddurim. So one of the interesting things about the Hasidim is that besides for causing a ruckus in quote unquote changing the Tachnun or modifying how it was done in Ashkenaz, which caused its own fights, you also find that they were much more reluctant to say Tachnun. And that is because Nefilat Apayim is seen by the Mikubalim. This is already something that begins in the 1600s, but it's seen by the Mikubalim based on a Zohar as something very risky to say. If a person has the correct kavanot by Mizmor Chafei, right? If a person has the correct kavanot, it's almost like you saying, Elecha Hashem nafshi asam, I'm giving my soul up to Hashem. The Zohar says if a person does these kavanot incorrectly, he could die because he's going to sacrifice his soul to Hashem. Ashkenazim never had a problem with this because they never said Mizmor Chafei. They never said this Mizmor in Tehillim until the Hasidim came around and started saying it, or at least some of their Siddurim started saying it. Then they started taking Tachanun much more seriously. And they were more reluctant to do Nefilat Apayim because of the dangers within. Another reason they began to be reluctant to do Nefilat Apayim was because they extended the list of the Beit Yosef. The Beit Yosef had a list of days which were a Yom Simcha or a Yom Moed, where it's inappropriate to do Nefilat Apayim, to do Tachanun. The Hasidim added many more days, a day for a Rebbe's yahrzeit, a day for this, a day for that. So they look for any excuse not to say Nefilat Apayim because they were aware of its extraordinary power. And that's a very important development in the 1700s, which kind of leads us into what happens in the 1800s with the Sfaradim. In Baghdad, especially, and in Eretz Yisrael, among the circles of Mekubalim, we find that people still say Tachnun, but they stop putting their head down. So similar reaction to the Hasidim. They are afraid of the power of Nefilat Apayim, but instead of not saying Tachnun altogether, the Sfaradim decide to keep doing Tachnun, but not to put their heads down. And the Ben Ish Chai testifies that in Baghdad, this became the minhag. People wouldn't put their head down. And he got some pushback from some people, and he sent a letter to Rabbi Eliyahu Mani. Rabbi Eliyahu Mani was one of the Mekubalim in Eretz Yisrael in Yerushalayim. He said, "Yeah, in Yerushalayim, us Mekubalim, we don't put our heads down because of the dangers mentioned in the Zohar." The Moroccan Sfarim argue against that. They're like, "What are you talking about? Everybody who does Nusach Sfarad, Syria, Morocco, everybody." Even Iraq, everyone used to put their heads down. Nobody was choshesh for this idea of the Zohar. What are you talking about? This is the Halacha and Shulchan Aruch. You put your head down by Nefilat Apayim. So the Moroccan Sfarim are very against this Baghdadi minhag to not put your head down by Nefilat Apayim. And then, how are you even calling it Nefilat Apayim if you don't putting your head down? The Gemara talks about the power of it. How could one not do it? So this was a minhag that began, I believe, in Baghdad. I could be wrong. Please, I didn't have time to sleuth this particular point, but from there it's migrated to Eretz Yisrael. It migrated, unfortunately, to even America. And a lot of Syrians in America don't do it anymore, and a lot of people find all sorts of excuses to abbreviate Tachnun or to not put their heads down by Tachnun. A lot of Moroccan congregations, Adei Yom Hazeh, still put our heads down for Tachnun, as it says in Shulchan Aruch. And they're very, very enthusiastic that we didn't get it from the Ashkenazim. We're just doing like the Shulchan Aruch says. A lot of the Moroccan Sfarim are pushing this point home. It's in Shulchan Aruch. This is what we do. This is how we do it. They push against this idea of being afraid based on Pia Kabbalah. Their argument is that it's only for the Mekubalim who are doing these kavanas. But if you're not doing these kavanas that the Zohar points out that the Zohar prescribes for the Mizmar Chafei, if you're not doing all these major kavanas because you're not a mikubal, there's no reason to be afraid. You're not going to give your soul to Hashem. You're not releasing your neshama from your body. Chill out. You could do Nefilat Apayim. That was another reaction that we find in the 19th century, in the 1800s. Finally, in the 20th century and in the late 1800s, we find a very sad development, and that is that the Enlightenment, the maskilim, so to speak, the haskala, hate Tachanun. They want to get rid of it completely. Frankly, to them, this was the age of enlightenment. This was at a time when there was a positive anthropology, when all of the philosophers were looking towards the newest branches of modern philosophy and the capability of mankind and the accomplishments of science, the accomplishments of philosophy, very positively. People, at least the Illuminati, were the enlightened people, were very optimistic about the future of humanity. And a prayer which spoke about how we're maggots, especially the longer Monday and Thursday one, to speak about how unworthy we are before Hashem and how humanity is always so full of sin. That wasn't the attitude among the enlightened thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century. They're like, humanity is not garbage that is always sinning, that needs to repair. God is not some spiteful being in the sky. We have to have more modern ideas of religion, and they didn't want to believe that humanity was intrinsically flawed or needed to do tshuva every single day, and they really didn't like the idea of Tachanun. Now, everything in moderation, obviously. I'm not here to make the theological argument for them. Obviously, Tachanun has its time and place, and no, Tachanun doesn't have to be about chait. It's just what it became. Historically, Tachanun became about chait, but it used to be about bakashot. It used to be about personal supplications. But in their view, it turned into a tremendously long diatribe about how sinful we are. So they really didn't like that, and they just completely took it out. The conservative took it out too at first, but started to bring it back in. Now a lot of conservative synagogues are bringing back the Orthodox way of praying. As you can see in the news, even like yesterday, there was another conservative shul that started davening Orthodox. But the Reform, Ad Yom Hazeh, they've never heard of Tachanun. You go to the average Reform person, and unfortunately, he's literally never heard of Nefilat Apayim. It's very sad. They intentionally destroyed Judaism in America with the intention of building something back better, but whether they did is up for debate, to say the least. Finally, 21st century. What does Tachanun mean to you today? And with this, we'll end. The funniest thing about Tachanun in the 21st century is that people have forgotten the early history of Tachanun. They don't realize that they have the permission to say whatever they want by Tachanun, and most people are comfortable with the structure and the fixity of the Siddur. They find comfort in that. Doing what the Siddur says, doing what my grandfather did and what his grandfather's grandfather did. In theory, if a person wanted to say a different paragraph to him by Tachanun, he could. If a person wanted to do the Nefilat Apayim and choose a shiur malos that meant more to him, he could. But today, people are very comfortable with the text. Most people don't question the text. They don't really care about exactly how their Siddur developed. They don't want to go through the past 5 centuries or 6 centuries of Siddurim. Most people are very comfortable with the Nusach HaTachanun today. However, what Tachanun means to people today, funny enough, is to them it is a marker of whether today is or isn't a holiday, or whether today is or isn't a Yom Simcha in our locale. That's what it became. And it's a very interesting thing. Like the fight over whether or not Yom Ha'atzmaut, for example, if we should say Tachanun or not, is a fight over Zionist philosophy. Is today a day to celebrate? Is today not a day to celebrate? If a Rebbe has a yard site, is this a Yom Simcha? Because I'm Baba, and this is the Baba Rebbe's this is Baba Vashul, this is the Baba Rebbe's yard site. We're not going to say Tachanun. Or, of course, do we say Tachanun because that's the Halacha Shulchan Aruch, right? It becomes a marker of very much identity of different sects of Klal Yisrael, and becomes a marker of whether or not people consider a certain day a chag. And because minhagim typically are so intrinsically tied with identity and group identity, people can be very offended if you try to say Tachanun on a day where they believe it is inappropriate to say Tachanun. Just yesterday, it was passing around social media. Somebody was sending a video, not yesterday, I'm sorry, on Hey Kislev. There was this Rebbe in Chabad. I don't know his name. I really should have get his name. But he was giving a shmooze to some Bachim in Yeshiva, and he was screaming about how could somebody imagine to say Tachanun on Hey Kislev? If you say Tachanun on Hey Kislev, you're so messed up, You must be the kind of guy who would say Tachanun on Yutes Kislev, right? This is how far it's gotten. Because again, if you're not Chabad, you're not going to understand either of those references. But let me just explain to you. Yutes Kislev is when one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes got out of prison. Hey Kislev is when one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes won a court case. Those are like Chagim for the modern extremist. I say at least Hey Kislev for the modern radical Lubavitch people. For them, it's such a Yom Simcha. This guy was dead serious, by the way. I could send you the video if you want, but he was dead serious. If you're saying Tachanun on Hey Kislev, you must be messed up. You must. He's like, it's not about books. Hey Kislev is not about the court case about books. It's about Benkel. It's about the Rebbe's chair as the Rebbe of. He's not like the other Rebbes. It's about the Rebbe's position. He was dead serious. He was a true chassid. For him, today's Yom Simcha. It's very personal. If somebody says Tachanun on Hey Kislev, it's offensive to him. And not because there's something intrinsically wrong with Tachanun, not because, what do you call it? Not because he has a halachic argument, but for him, it's about group identity. You're not one of us. You are not, you're not part of the hashkafis of Chabad. You can sit outside if you want to say Tachanun on Hey Kislev. The point I'm trying to make is that Tachanun, almost because of its optional nature and because it was never a halachic fixity that had to be said every single day, that Shulchan Aruch commands you to say every single day, or that the Gemara or whatever commands you to say every day, the nature of its minhag, the nature of its optional, of the fact that it's optional, turned into a more of a reflection. Whether or not people say Tachanun is not a reflection of whether or not how pious they are. It's a reflection of who they are and what days they consider to be a Yom Simcha or what group of Klal Yisrael they're from. So Tachanun, in a very funny way, comes full circle to be less about tefillah and more about, well, is today Yom Tov or not? Or is today, am I davening in what kind of shul today? So, in my opinion, we have to get a little bit past that. I personally, if the congregation is not saying Tachanun for a reason I feel like is a little silly, I will surreptitiously say Tachanunim, because I don't think that if nobody catches you, I don't think it's really a problem. But that's my own personal opinion. And again, I'm not here to take anybody's sides. Whatever you do is fine. It isn't optional tefillah, but please remember that it is an important tefillah. Don't divorce it from what it is, which is a tefillah, which is important, which can inspire, which was intended to be an inspirational, self-motivated tefillah at the end of Shemona Esrei, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. It shouldn't become an object of fighting. It shouldn't become an object of group identity. All right, so with that, we'll end. We're doing Kaddish here, and I hope to continue next week.